We have an exciting panel discussion coming up. I'd like to introduce Rabbi Simon Jacobson, the Dean of the Meaningful Life Center, an author, a scholar, a publisher of a newspaper for many years. Jeff Chiesa, leading partner at the firm Chiesa, Shahini and Giantamasi, former U.S. Senator, Attorney General. It's an honor to have you here with us. Karen Kessler, who is the head of Kessler PR firm, the leading public relations specialist in all of New Jersey and beyond. It's great to have you back on our panel. And of course, Ben Brofman. Let's give him a round of applause as we start our panel portion of the program. So as is our tradition, we have a three-part program, and we're going to end right on time. By 8:30, we're going to be done. By 8:35, the room will be empty. Everyone will have their honey-glazed challahs, be out the door, and life will be wonderful. It's a CLE program. We're going to go through the CLE topics, and we have three parts to our panel this evening. Part number one, we're going to get into the trouble of cancel culture, which Ben alluded to in his remarks, presumption of innocence and people being canceled when maybe they shouldn't be. Part number two, we're going to get into the question of who should be canceled, or in other words, when people are doing things that are inappropriate or wrong, if it was many years ago, if people don't know about it, what responsibility do we have within firms, within relationships to cancel people or punish people for things that may have happened way back when. And part number three, which I think we'll spend the most time on, which Mr. Brofman alluded to as well, is redemption and apologies and forgiveness and how people gain their reputations back. But as is our tradition, we always start each segment of our program with a short film clip. I find it ironic that much discussion has been made about the book To Kill a Mockingbird being canceled from schools because of language that it contains. So we're going to start with a clip of Atticus Finch. Pay attention to the screens, please.
Now, gentlemen, in this country, our courts are the great levelers. In our courts, all men are created equal. I'm no idealist to believe firmly in the integrity of our courts and of our jury system. That's no ideal to me. That is a living, working reality. Now, I am confident that you gentlemen will review without passion the evidence that you have heard, come to a decision, and restore this man to his family. In the name of God, do your duty. In the name of God, believe. Tom Robinson.
Powerful words and powerful clip. I'd like to begin our conversation. Jeff, I'm going to put you in the hot seat first. Public perception. The courts are the great levelers of justice, but public perception is what it is. What impact does that have in the practice of law, particularly within the relationships that go on within a larger firm and the dynamics of a larger firm?
So there's two parts that I think, Rabbi, and thank you for inviting me tonight. I'm really honored to be here with this distinguished panel, and I thank all of you for spending the time with us tonight. From a lawyer's perspective, when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, there was a rule that U.S. Attorney Christie had that before you were ever going to make in any way public something about a prominent person, you better be really, really sure you had the goods on the case. Because as Mr. Brofman pointed out earlier, once that becomes public, there's no taking it back. For one thing, no one really cares to listen. That story is not nearly as interesting as the one that you were a bad guy. Not nearly as interesting. And second, you're going to have to dig long and hard to find it. 2 weeks, 3 years, whenever that happens. And so I think from a prosecutor's perspective, there is a solemn obligation to make sure that when you're doing these investigations, you're doing them with incredible clarity, that there's no leaking, and this has happened, and it happened in the Department of Justice in a way, quite frankly, when Senator Menendez that indictment was leaked beforehand, that's an unforgivable occurrence. Because once that happens, it's inevitable, whatever the grand jury is going to do, that case became inevitable at that point. That never should have happened. And so I think we always thought that we had that obligation in all of those cases to make sure that we were doing that. In private practice, what I learned on the defense side is you're dealing every night, that person who's the subject of that investigation or that allegation, if it becomes public, they're looking to put their head down on the pillow every night and try to go to sleep and try to maintain relationships with their family and whether it's with their church or their priest or their rabbi or their relatives. And that's really hard. And it's really hard to convince people once that issue becomes public that you're wrong. And Mr. Brofman used some percentages earlier. The government does do a very, very effective job, in my experience, of being careful about this. But it should never be allowed to happen where before you're ready and prepared to bring a case that anything is talked about publicly. Anything. Because as soon as that happens, with the way the information travels now, it's impossible to take it back. And so I think on the defense side of this, you're working uphill all the time to try to get that perception back. And certainly whether it's a judge or a jury, or quite frankly, the community that these people live in, once that issue has become public, it's a very difficult situation for that. So we're very sensitive to that in our practice.
Thank you very much. Karen, you're in public relations. You've been doing this a long time. Your work is deeply embedded within the legal community. Give us a little perception. What's going on when we say cancel culture? How is that impacting life and reality and PR and the practice of law? You're the expert. Give us the perspective here.
Who likes to play a lawyer but isn't one. I would say this, Rabbi. I think you really need to define cancel culture. Cancel culture is not the court that Ben and Jeff work in. It's a court of public opinion, and it's a court where there's no presumption of innocence. It's a court where there's no fairness. Those words just don't exist in that court. And it's not just those of you who litigate. It's those of you who are in employment law. Those of you in education law, it's those of you in trademark and IP law, it's those of you in matrimonial law and tax trust and estates. I mean, we see all of cancel culture affecting those kinds of matters all the time. It's far bigger and it's far broader. It's heartbreaking sometimes to see that something that is unintentional takes off and can cancel and can create these kinds of issues. Sometimes it's the business cycle at work. But it is really a much bigger issue and a broader issue than just something that litigators have to deal with.
Rabbi Jacobson, you're the scholar on the panel, Jewish law, Jewish ethics, Jewish values. The Torah talk much about cancel culture? Does anyone canceled in the Bible? Give us a little perspective here from the Jewish side of things about cancel culture.
Firstly, thank you as well for the honor to be with my distinguished panel. Thank you all. Yeah, absolutely. The very word cancel is a despicable word. I don't even know if there's a word in Hebrew for it, to be honest, or in the Bible, because it essentially defies the very principle of what is human dignity. Even if somebody has sinned, even if somebody has transgressed, and that also, we have to presume everyone is innocent, that is very clear. But even if it's been established, you still don't cancel anyone. There's a powerful expression in the Talmud that says, may the sins be erased, but not the sinner. Because essentially what you're dealing with here is something the founding fathers actually recognized from the Bible, that all people are created equal. And no matter how they behave, they're still created in the divine image and have unalienable rights. That doesn't mean we don't have free will. That doesn't mean we sometimes do things that are quite disturbing. But to cancel someone is essentially the ultimate, we call it even murder. The Talmud says that when you insult someone in public, it's called murder, because you've basically
Mr.
embarrassed
Brofman's got a lot of work to do now. He's got there are a lot of people to defend
So,
if that's the definition of
if
murder.
you're taking the Torah standards, it's a far cry from what we have, because the concept doesn't even exist. There's no such thing. You're essentially like canceling God himself and canceling God's giving the human right that each of us has the dignity to be a human being. You know, it reminds me when I was a kid and we played musical chairs. I always hated musical chairs because there was always that one kid that couldn't find the chair. And at once I actually gave up my chair for a kid because I saw how embarrassed he was. I found it to be a cruel game. I don't know how you feel about it, but it's a small little taste. Remember, these things are impressionable and they can grow into big monsters. So I don't even have any stronger words than to say that the concept is so despicable because it challenges everything we believe in about human beings. And tell me, is there anyone in this room, anyone on earth that has not sinned, that has not transgressed, that hasn't made a mistake in their life? That's why you cancel them? Absolutely not. Not our children, and not strangers.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. A lot to think about over there. I want to move things right along, and Mr. Brofman, I'm going to turn to you. One of the elements of cancel culture is not just when someone presumably does something inappropriate or did something and we find out about it, but there's an element of guilty by association. You were with that person, you knew about something, you were a partner, you were a friend, you were married, a child, a parent, and I'm sure you get a lot of that because that whole list of people you've represented over time, some may be wonderful, some may be not so much, and I presume people have come to you over the years and said, how could you represent someone like that? And I would presume there's a thought, some would say, to cancel you because of your association. How have you dealt with that? How do you deal with that? Tell me about that.
Well, you know,
And we'll give everyone else a chance to get a little personal on that question.
No,
too.
that's all right. I'm used to it. It's I meant to include in my remarks, but I was trying to meet the deadline.
Which
You
we
know,
appreciate, thank you.
I've probably, and I say this, and people are going to say, "What do you mean?" I've probably talked more people out of committing suicide than most psychiatrists in the United States, and it's a profound statement. But I've watched people being told they have cancer. I've watched people told they have a terminal illness of one kind or another, and panic sets in. But what you see is the family unit draws closer, and people care about you, and even strangers offer you sympathy and advice and comfort. And when someone is told that they are about to be indicted or that they may be going to prison, I've seen families break up in my conference room where children walk out on parents when they're told that they can't continue at Brown University, they're going to have to go to City College, which is, because suddenly all their money is being taken away and all of their assets are frozen. And I've seen spouses fight with each other because sometimes what was going on is being kept from the person you love the most, and they're the last to know. I've had to deal with people who are basically saying to me, I'm probably better off dead, because if I die before I'm convicted, none of my assets get forfeited, which is true. And if I just die, people will not know why I died. They'll just say, oh, it's terrible, he was such a good man, and before it hits the fan, I just walk in front of a train or fall in front of a car, or I take an untraceable poison. And it's horrific because the loneliness is unlike anything, you could possibly imagine. I've been doing this for close to 50 years. I'm still not used to it. I'm still not used to, you can actually see, I think there's an expression in show business, it's called flop sweat. I'm just about to disappoint everybody in the entire world I've ever known who thinks I'm a virtuous, upstanding, legitimate person who is successful, and now I'm going to wear a jumpsuit and live in a prison for however long. And it takes extraordinary patience and extraordinary effort, to tell people that there's life for them after this passes, and they don't believe you. And today, sometimes I go to a family celebration of someone I've had that conversation with 20 years ago, and they grab me and they whisper in my ear, "You were right. I'm glad I didn't kill myself. I'm glad I didn't just, jump in front of a train." So I think the panelists who have spoken about this, I think we're all saying the same thing, maybe because I'm in the trenches every day, and maybe because I feel it more. And someone said to me, "What do you think has made you a very successful criminal defense lawyer?" And I say, mazel, luck, and I care. And when you care as a criminal defense lawyer, it's very wearing. And at the end of the day, if you don't care, do something else, because you have someone else's life on your shoulders. And I'm just telling you a conversation I had somebody a couple of weeks ago. Someone I don't know called me and said, "You don't know me, but I need to ask you an important question." I said, "Okay, why would someone I don't know get to ask?" She says, "I'll explain in a minute." Says, "You represented this person." I said, "I did." "And why are you asking me? The case is 30 years old." He said, "Well, I have a grandson who's dating his granddaughter. And I know he was found not guilty, but I need you to tell me, is he a good person?" And I said, "What a stupid question. If it was you, would you like me to tell a stranger or answer that question?" And I hung up the phone. And it made me very sad for the rest of the day that generations later, a kid who wasn't even born at the time of this event is going to have someone in their new life questioning the person they don't know because at some point they were embarrassed or they were publicly ridiculed or they were written about as being fundamentally corrupt, and they were found not guilty. But not guilty doesn't mean that you were innocent in the world.
Karen, help us out over here. All we really have in life is our reputation. Tomorrow night, there's a retirement dinner for Justice Albin, who's spoken on our panel. He actually sang from the stage over here during our Fiddler on the Roof segment a few years ago, and I'm giving the invocation. I'm going to talk about his wonderful reputation.
He has a good reputation.
He has a very good reputation. That's why I'm mentioning it. But you deal with a lot of people whose reputation is all they have, and it's on the line. How do you deal with those types of issues when you're sitting across from someone who says, "What do I have to live for if my reputation's gone?"
Listen, I think there's two things. First of all, I think Ben's story, which is about the compassion we have to have and about what happens when someone's indicted, is not that different from when we counsel clients. We also say sometimes that we're more of a therapist than we are anything else. We listen and we talk to people that are going through difficult times, but that's not cancel culture. Cancel culture is the world of the internet. Cancel culture is the world of the media. Cancel culture is not when your wife is angry at you because you never told her that you were stealing money from your company and now you're getting indicted. That's a whole different marital issue, for sure, but it is not cancel culture. It's canceling maybe your marriage, but it's not cancel culture. Cancel culture is really that person who's 25 years old and is up for a job and somebody finds that when they were 18 they did something really incredibly stupid, and all of a sudden it goes public and all of a sudden it goes viral because they're up for a high profile job and they're trying to figure out, how do I get out of it? How do I begin to work on a reputation and maintain a reputation or build a reputation when I am being, in essence, publicly indicted for something that happened that I did when I was young, when I was not thinking, when I said something dopey on the internet, when I liked a comment that I shouldn't have liked. Those are, to me, the really most heartbreaking in some ways, because it is really such a momentary kind of action that has such a long-lasting effect. And to your point, I would never use reputation defender, ever. Please make sure they save their money. But a lot of that, and there are some techniques to be able to walk back from that, and many of you in the room know, because I've worked with a lot of you, which I'm very fortunate to have done, that there are ways to deal with the public and the media and these things. But that's what cancel culture is. It is not that we sit in judgment of those we know or the ramifications of that. It is those that don't know us that are making those decisions based on what they're reading or what they're hearing.
Well, from that perspective, I want to turn to Jeff for a moment, because one of the things that has happened in cancel culture is we have had an element of guilty by association, or firms, particularly corporate firms, that all of a sudden are starting to question the company policies of the people they do business with. What type of representation do you have in terms of diversity, in terms of politics, in terms of if you represented that person, we don't want to do business with you. There's a high-profile attorney who's been all over the paper who's been canceled, Mr. Dershowitz, right? You worked with him, I'm not going to work with you. How would you deal with that if a corporate client comes along and says, hold on a second, in your criminal department, you're representing someone, or you've been involved in a particular matter with an administration. We don't want to do business with a company like that. Does that happen? And B, how do you deal with that?
First of all of our clients are innocent, so I want to make sure everybody understands that. Listen, I think you're going to have to make a decision based upon the relationships, right? Our practice in so many ways is based upon relationships, and so what we do, and we try to do, and many of my colleagues are here, and I value their judgments and their insights on this stuff. And so we'll sit and talk about those things. When a case comes in, when we're asked to get involved in a case, there are cases we don't get involved in. And it's not because we don't think we can help, it's because we think it's the kind of case that's either not consistent with our expertise necessarily, but it's also decisions are made because we think that there can be a perception associated with that kind of representation. And so our folks, and as I said, I'm so lucky to work with the people that I work with, because we've had very candid discussions about these things, and there's not always unanimity on those decisions. But in the end, we come to a decision that we think is in the best interest of the firm, the best, all the things that we're trying to do to maintain and advance our reputation so that we can continue to flourish as a business. But there are times where it's not cut and dry. And you don't know. It's not like we can go, let me call 3 of our clients and see what they're going to say if we take this case.
Jeff, interrupt for a second, what would be an unreasonable demand a corporate client is asking your firm to do that you'd say, we're not going to deal with that?
You know, I don't want to get into an exact instance.
Not your firm, a firm, some firm.
Yeah, listen, as I
what are
said,
the types of demands a supposed client may have from a firm?
well, what it would really come down to, as I said, is the fact that our firm is involved in the case. Are people going to say, what are they doing? Like, how could they? And listen, it may be that there are situations where we've taken cases and people say, what are they doing? But you're trying to balance that decision making with all of the things you're trying to do in a firm of our size, and then trying to make sure. And listen, my general counsel Ron Israel's here. My former managing partner Dan Schwartz is here. I talk to them all the time about these things because I want to know what they think, and I want to understand how we have different practice areas, but I want to understand because I trust their judgment and I trust their decision making so completely that if they have a visceral reaction to a certain client, I know that we're headed in a direction that's not probably in the firm's interest.
Rabbi Jacobson, I want to turn to you for a moment as a publisher of one of the most famous Yiddish newspapers around today, the Allgemeiner Journal. When it comes to publishing news and being in a position where you have the media was one of the enemies Mr. Brofman mentioned, the government and the media in certain cases, you have an opportunity to effectively cancel someone's reputation just by publishing a story about them. Or do Yiddish newspapers have their own Yiddish guidelines? Like, how does it work in terms of handling people's reputations vis-a-vis the public readership?
Just because you say it in Yiddish doesn't mean you have a right to cancel anyone. So firstly, just to correct, it was a Yiddish newspaper when my father founded it in 1972. Now it's an English one, so we don't no longer have that foreign language cover. In many ways, it could be even more responsible, or we have to be even more responsible in the media than in courts, because exactly for that reason, someone can write an article, and even if you can't sue them, it can destroy a person's life. So you have to have really strong checks and balances. And we have a whole process. If anyone's going to attack an individual We're not talking about a policy or an ideology or a concept, but a name of an individual. You need to have not just verification, you need to have 5 verifications. And it has to be established by others. We're not the court of law, so a newspaper should never be the one that indicts someone. A newspaper can report on facts that have been established, on allegations that have been established, but nothing more than that. And it's I mean, a lot of journalists don't necessarily live up to these standards, to be very honest. That's why we have the problems we have. In our case, it's a very, as I said before, to me, it's a responsibility not just on a humane level and a moral and ethical one, it's actually a responsibility to the very essence of what makes us humans. And we've had situations. I remember my father, some of you may remember Gershon Jacobson. I remember he once telling me, he said to me that when you run a newspaper, you have to remember that when you write something bad about somebody, one person won't be happy, but many others will be happy. When you write something good about somebody, one person will be happy, but many people won't be happy. So the truth is you can't win, but you still have to maintain the highest possible standards because, yes, one word said about an individual, even if it's unintentional, can destroy a life. And it's as simple as that. I don't think you can cut corners in any way or compromise. And you have to bend over backwards. And if necessary, you just don't mention a name unless it's absolutely been proven or you're just repeating facts that have already been established elsewhere.
And we can continue that discussion in the freedom of speech, symposiums, which we've done and we'll do in the future. Mr. Brofman has something to add.
I think today, unfortunately, I don't think most publications genuinely care about whether they are right or wrong. They care whether it is properly sourced. And most publications report based on anonymous sources that rarely do they ever have to identify or disclose. And without anonymous sources, I think major publications would be out of business in like a minute. And I also think that the technology and the speed of technology, and I'll give you a perfect example. The highest profile case I think I've ever been in was when I represented Dominic Strauss-Kahn, who was the president of the International Monetary Fund. And I can say it because it was in every newspaper in the world. And when we go to court, there would be 6,000, 7,000 reporters on the street. They would turn and block down Center Street. And when I was in court one day, I was leaning over the shoulder of a reporter who was working on an iPad. And I was able to read it. And I said, excuse me, if you wait 10 minutes till the judge comes out, you will learn that you were wrong. Just wait. And he looked at me and he said, I can't wait. He and she, they are posting. And I need to post because we all work on an artificial, instantaneous deadline. So that today those rules, I think, are completely out the window. You need to publish, you need to print, and used to be the deadline was the next day. Today it's like the next minute. I also want to mention the name of someone we should all remember. He had probably one of the best quotes after being acquitted. It was Ray Donovan, not the loan shark who was portrayed on Netflix or HBO. This Ray Donovan was, I think, the Secretary of Labor maybe 40, 50 years ago. He was indicted with great fanfare. He spent 6 months on trial in the Bronx, and he was completely acquitted. And he turned around to the first reporter and said, where do I go to get my reputation back? That quote was heard around the world, and it's true, and it's, it basically foretold the future, because I don't see people really, getting their reputation back unless they're in a hip-hop world where it's not a bad thing to be
I'm going to disagree with you.
Indicted and acquitted.
I'm going to disagree with you. I'm going to say there are certain career fields, no doubt, that have a shorter path back. If you are an athlete with a rabid fan base, you're going to come back. If you are a chef, celebrity chef, with a dedicated following, you're going to come back. If you are a singer with a dedicated following, you're going to come back. Because I see it, because we've represented those people, and they do come back. And if you're somebody who knows how to apologize and apologize fast, I'm not talking about those that are on trial, but those who have had other kinds of issues, there is also a road back. If you are somebody who's going to sit there and say, I didn't do anything wrong, and it is so unfair that I am getting judged like this, you're going to sit for a really long time with that reputation in tatters, because you're as good as your digital footprint. It just is the world we're in.
If you can, Karen, if you can give 3 pointers to people in the room. You have a room full of attorneys here. 3 pointers of what to do or what not to do in the world of social media cancel
Every
culture.
single one of you should have a search on for your name. And I don't want to hear that I'm not on social media, so it doesn't matter, because there's somebody else who's on social media with the same name you have, and if they do something wrong, people are going to think it's you. So if you don't have a search on for your own name, number one, tonight, go, and if you don't know how to do it, ask your kids or ask a
In the
friend.
booklet, there are notes. The
Right.
last pages, you could write this down if you wanted.
I would say that's number one. Number two, if your company or your, whatever, your law firm doesn't have a social media policy and you haven't looked at it lately and you're still talking about MySpace and AOL in a world in which those are not the platforms that people use anymore, you better update it and you better make sure you have one and you better make sure that everybody knows it and that it's spread throughout. Sort of that's number two. And number three, you should have a plan in place. You know, we write crisis communications plans. Sometimes they're like this, sometimes they're like this. But you should have a plan in place for when it goes south. When it goes south for your firm, when it goes south for your clients. You should have some sense of what you're going to do at that point, because what happens too often is all of a sudden there's a barrage of media coverage and, you know, you're swimming upstream and it's hard to sort of recoup when it's already come out like that. Those
Rabbi,
would
you
be
want
my
to jump
three.
in? Anything you want to add on that?
Well, I will say this, just recently, actually, at Algemeiner, and algemeiner.com, if you want to check it out, we had a situation the other way around.
Algemeiner spelled Aleph, Lamed, Gimel. No, okay. We'll send the link out later.
Where actually somebody was attacked in another media outlet without mentioning names, because I don't want to destroy their reputation, and he asked us for a platform to be able to defend himself. He said that he feels we're fair and that we're balanced, and we had to review that because we also didn't want to whitewash him. We didn't want to suddenly be assume, and we did the research, and actually we allowed him to write an article, which received a lot of publicity. I hope the best for him. You know, we did not pass judgment. Is he guilty or innocent? That's not a job of a media outlet. But I felt from a purely ethical point of view, and I completely agree with Ben, I think it's very difficult today in the media world because speed is of essence. It's not just sources, but also other things you want to, I mean, bottom line is, there's a bottom line. The media wants to make money, and gossip sells, let's be honest. Look at the shows out there. So I will say very proudly about the Algemeiner that we have a pretty sterling reputation in the sense we don't accept anonymous sources for anything that attacks a human being. You know, anonymous sources for something that will not affect someone. Someone needs to protect their confidentiality, but we have a very strong ironclad policy around that. I wish other media outlets would learn, but they have to have first their own standards, let's be honest. If you're running a company and you don't have high standards, of course it's going to seep down, and everyone, all your underlings and all the subordinates are going to understand, hey, you know, anything goes as long as you can defend it or protect it with some anonymous source. And that's a tremendous tragedy that is an extension of cancel culture, a media that is no longer really credible. Let's be honest, ask most Americans, what do they think about the media? It's become political and polarized and so on.
You know, I'm reluctant to quote a Jewish scholar when I'm on the panel with one of the foremost Jewish scholars in the world, but, you know, the Rambam,
He's talking about you,
Maimonides.
Jeff. He's talking about you.
I'm talking to Karen.
Yeah. My mother would appreciate that, thank you.
You know, the Rambam, Maimonides, once said that if you want to say something, think before you speak. If you're going to write something, think twice before you write. And when I speak to high school students, I am stunned by how cavalierly they press the send button without reading or thinking about what they have just written or texted. I am stunned by how often they hit reply all when they don't mean to hit reply all, and suddenly panic sets in because someone who you are talking about is now going to get what you're saying and know that it came from you, and there's no, you know, taking it back. So, you know, I think technology has been great. It's been helpful in many ways, and, you know, I'm not in any way suggesting to the contrary, but man, it has opened a can of worms in so many communities and so many arenas and so many different levels of teenage You know, I'm counseling a kid now. You know what he's charged with? He's charged with sending a lewd picture of his former girlfriend to everyone in his class. And I said to him, how did this happen? He said, well, she loved me, so we exchanged sex pictures, and then she broke up with me. So I wanted to punish her. And I hit send, and I hit reply all, and it went out. And what you don't know is how many people who get it then forward it to everyone they know. And suddenly what you thought was a private insult, 1 million people are getting it, and it will be forever. And that person, both of them, will never, ever live it down if someone really starts to investigate them.
Rabbi, can I
Yeah,
just
go
jump
ahead,
in?
yeah.
I was just going to say two things. One thing that I'll never understand is, you know, when I'm 57, when I was growing up, you could be stupid anonymously, right? You made mistakes, did stupid things. What I don't understand now is someone will say, you know, I have a really offensive idea. Before I express it, get your camera out and film me saying it so I can send it and it'll be on the internet forever. And it happens over and over again, whether it's sending pictures, whether it's sending incredibly offensive comments, it happens over and over again. But the other thing I would add to what Karen's saying, and this is a bit of a pitch for her, is when you have a case and it's simmering and you anticipate that there may be some bad press coming, it makes a lot of sense to engage with a professional like Karen so that you're not caught flat-footed when it does happen. Because if you're caught flat-footed when it happens, it's almost impossible to unwind. But if you have a plan in place that you can activate, and that would include affirmatively going to some of these press outlets where Karen or others will have relationships so that you can start to create a narrative that's not going to destroy the case or the situation that your client is in.
Jeff, while I have you, thank you very much for that. On the topic of cancel culture, you had a colleague in the Senate who was effectively canceled, Al Franken. Give us a little perspective of your interactions and how he was treated for a comedy matter, which is a whole interesting discussion I'd love to get through briefly before we move on to the next segment.
So I was in the Senate for 5 months in 2013, and I was an Al Franken fan. And I didn't know much about him as a professional. What I will tell you is that he was a very, very serious legislator. Took the job seriously, he worked really hard, and he was, while our politics weren't aligned 100%, he was a colleague that you could have an intelligent discussion with. I'm not going to defend what happened because that's for people's own judgments to be made. But what happened in that case was a long and productive life was eviscerated in a matter of days. It's, unless you're appointed to the Senate like I was, it's really hard to get there. There are all kinds of obstacles, all kinds of things, all kinds of sacrifices that the candidates and their families make to get there. And then you take the job seriously, and then you're well-liked and respected by your colleagues. You may know he's a Harvard graduate, Al Franken. And in a very short period of time, the pressure on a lot of folks, in my view, became so persistent that judgments were made and calls for his resignation happened very quickly. What's very interesting, and I took a look at this because I couldn't remember, there were 9 senators who took back what they had said about Al Franken after he resigned. It was too late. His career as a legislator was over, a career he worked really hard for. People like Pat Leahy, who was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. People like Angus King, who's independent but aligned politically with Al Franken. Heidi Heitkamp, the former Attorney General from North Dakota. Bill Nelson from Florida. These are all Democrats. And I think Senator Leahy, who'd been has been in the Senate close to 45 or 50 years, said it was one of the biggest regrets he had as a senator because putting aside, what never happened in that situation was a dispassionate evaluation of the conduct. There's a Senate Ethics Committee. There are investigative bodies that should have had an opportunity to evaluate what happened. It may have been after that evaluation that people would have concluded that he no longer is a suitable member of this legislative body. But when that doesn't happen, and it becomes so overwhelming, and I'm sure Ben's been in this situation where you watch somebody day after day get bombarded, and you're just like, I'm done. I can't withstand it. I can't go home every night and deal with my family, and I'm going to have it. And I think Senator Franken's now back as a professional comedian. He's obviously a very gifted comedian. But that period of time was, I don't know exactly what it was, Rabbi, but it was very short. It ended his career, and I'm sure those apologies, as sincere as they are, ring pretty hollow for him because they did not result in him, and I don't think they'll ever result in him getting that Senate seat back.
But he would be the first, Al Franken would be the, excuse me, Al Franken would be the first to tell you that he regrets resigning, and that, you know, I represented Harvey Weinstein for a couple of months.
I left him off your biography if you didn't want to go there. There were a lot of people I crossed out before I mentioned all the charitable causes.
At the time, I was representing a professional killer who murdered 19 people and dismembered them, and I would meet people on the street and they would say, hope you get him off, he seems like a good guy. I was representing Harvey Weinstein and people would come up to me in the street and said, I hope you die. But I'll tell you, I think Al Franken would never have been put in a position where he had to where he felt he had to resign, if not for the cultural sea change that happened. And I'm not defending what he did, but what he did relative to what other, you know, senators, God bless them, get away with every day, it's not so bad. You know, not enough to get you to resign. And I agree with you. Had he fought that, I think he would have prevailed.
So here's the question I want to put out there. When it comes to comedy, and he was a comedian, does that give you a leeway that otherwise you wouldn't in society? Can you say, I remember my mother, blessed memory, I'd come home when I was a little boy, and I'd repeat a joke I heard wherever I heard it, and it wasn't so nice. And she'd say, you know, that's not very nice. And I'd say, but it's funny. And she'd say, but it's not very nice. And I'd say, but it's funny. I'd say, just because it's funny doesn't mean it's nice and doesn't mean it's okay. Where do we balance someone saying, well, I'm a comedian? I mean, have you ever heard a comedian do a routine where they didn't make fun of anyone or anything? There's nothing to say. There's no humor there. Where do we go with that? The Jewish people have been comedians since the beginning of time. Moses had, you know, statements to God of, what do you want from me? How am I supposed to deal with these people? Rabbi Jacobson, comedy, are you allowed to slander, insult, belittle, if it's, well, I was just kidding? Like, what's the Jewish perspective on comedy?
The Jews created comedy, so I think it's, I know some comedians also have to resort to lowball jokes and dirty jokes and stuff like that. I find it commendable to find a great comedian that does not need to attack individuals. I think a good way is being self-deprecating. You know, you could always attack yourself, you know, if you really want to humiliate someone. But the truth is, from a Jewish point of view, even attacking yourself is not appropriate. No. So,
is one allowed to belittle themselves?
No, actually not, because you don't own your own life. You're not allowed to mutilate yourself. You're not allowed to humiliate yourself. It's because you're not your own property. Simple as that. You don't control it and you don't own it. And how much more so other people's lives. So I have to say unequivocally, no, I would not find it commendable that a comedian, even the name of humor, and even if the person he's laughing at laughs along. At the end of the day, it's feeding into some of our lower common denominator elements, which is to laugh at someone, to mock someone. And I'm not speaking now as a type of like fire and brimstone rabbi here and saying, let's stone the comedian. But I think I would believe that comedians reflect the standards of society, what they can get away with. If we wouldn't accept it, they wouldn't do it, to be honest.
Karen.
Self-deprecating.
There'll be a lot less laughs in this world, Rabbi. And listen,
When can someone say, I was just kidding, I was making a joke,
but
I'm
the
a
market
comedian."
reacts. The market reacts. If the market doesn't think it's funny, they're not going to buy tickets to your show. And if the market likes what you're saying, they're going to buy tickets to your show. And there are comedians like Dave Chappelle, who people have tried to cancel time and time again, who sort of stands up and basically says, I don't care. If you don't like me, don't come to my show. But I'm going to do the performance that I'm going to do, and because I think it's funny, and if you think it's funny, then I assume that you're going to be one of those people sitting in my audience. And if you don't, turn the channel, turn me off, don't buy my album, don't do my, I mean, that's sort of how that all works. And it may not be in keeping, I understand, with sort of the highest of ethical calling to be a comedian, perhaps, but I will say it brings a lot of joy to an awful lot of people, and people pick and choose who they find funny, and they go to those places, and there's a long history of very funny Jewish comedians who, listen, wasn't that what Don Rickles was all about? He made fun of people all the time, but if people knew it wasn't in mean-spirited way, it was in a way that brought laughs to the audience.
Well, but,
Mr. Warren.
African-American comedians, some of them get away with, humor about other African-Americans that a white person could never get away with. And, it's tolerated. And some of it is, funny. And even to African-Americans, it's funny. I think that self-deprecating humor, the greatest Jewish comedians in the history of our lives began with self-deprecating humor. I mean, Woody Allen has a lot of issues, but his humor was often self-deprecating.
We're going to talk about him in the next segment of who should have been canceled. Right? We'll get there in a moment. But Jeff, you tell me, within the practice of law, when someone says, well, I was just kidding, I was joking around, I was just having a good time, I thought it would be funny to do this, do that, we're in a social setting, the firm's away somewhere, or wherever it may be within relevance to the attorney-client relationship. You told the joke, it fell flat. Well, now, all of a sudden, they don't want you to represent them anymore. Now they want to sue you, or now that they're going to the end of the world. Look at the transcript. You can't do a transcript of a joke. It has no context. It has no flavor. How do we deal with that in law?
So the first thing is you're in any business setting, you're trying to be respectful of all your coworkers. And so I love people with a great sense of humor. I'm not a great joke teller. There are folks who are great joke tellers. But there are things I started practicing in 1991, and there were things that would be done and said then that would absolutely not pass the sniff test now. I don't think it was because the folks then were being mean-spirited or in any way trying to necessarily demean anybody, but we know the environment that we now exist in is completely different. And so I think that we all have to be really careful about the ways that we engage with our colleagues. And there can never be a moment where a colleague feels disrespected or demeaned, as the rabbi was saying, because then you're creating a work environment that's not sustainable, not going to be productive, and not one that people are going to want to continue to be a part of. And so if you're building something that's trying to get to an inclusive and diverse and open environment where people can engage with each other in a way that's professional and social, but there are things, and I think what you're really talking about, Rabbi, is the screening process and the kind of people that you're trying to hire. And those are judgments we're making all the time as we go through that process. Now, you're not going to be able to predict with certainty that everybody you bring in is going to exercise that kind of judgment.
You've got to be
That's where
careful with
references
humor.
come
And
from.
in a job interview, be careful with the humor because,
I'll give you one example. And I had somebody in a government position who we were going to make the offer to. The position required Senate confirmation. I said, you can't tell anybody because it'll be announced, they're going to be announcing it shortly. That night it went on Facebook. And, immediately you're thinking to yourself, was I unclear about the not talking about it? Is there any Facebook exemption I was unaware of? But that's what happened. And that's an adult, competent person. And I wonder, that's immediately cause for alarm on somebody's judgment. But those are the things that continue to happen. But I think it's really hard. We do everything we can through our hiring and vetting process to bring people in that we think they're going to contribute to a culture of inclusivity and professionalism. And I think we've been pretty successful at it, but you can't always predict what's going to happen.